Welcome, everyone. I want to welcome you to our special conversation today with a frontline evolutionary friend of mine and a co-teacher in the Evolutionary Collective work that I'm doing. It's Jeff Carreira. He's also the head of education for Enlighten Next. And today we're going to look at, with you, and you're more than welcome to call in and ask your questions and be in a dialogue with us, considering the possibility of having an epic life. It came out of a conversation that Jeff and I were having about, can you imagine having a historically significant life? Being a hero, having a significant influence in the world. And, when you think about that kind of a question, for the most, I think for 99.9% of us, we don't identify with being someone who would be participating in life that way, that we would have some kind of historic significance, or that we would even consider that as a possibility. So we are going to have that conversation. So I want to welcome you, Jeff.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia. It's a pleasure to be on with you again, as always.
Yeah. There's another inspiration for it. So it was partly the conversation that we were having, and also I just want to mention, just in the sort of lead into the conversation, is I had seen a long time ago a Jane McGonigal TED Talk, which I highly recommend that people get a hold of and see. You can go on to I just wrote a blog about it. And she speaks about gaming, video game, people that are, there's over 1 billion people that are involved in playing online video games, and that people spend 3 billion hours a week actually playing online games. 3 billion hours a week, which is unbelievable. When I heard that, I was just like, wow. And so when you think about, like, why is that so compelling for people? I mean, there must be something innately within that is really significant and important. And so one of the things that she says in it that was very inspiring to me was that games like World of Warcraft inspire people's desire to collaborate and to cooperate in a world-saving mission. So it has to do with having this epic mission that they're a part of, where what they're working on is meaningful, and that you can, when you show up online, immediately you have people that you can count on, that are ready to be supportive, that are ready to jump in, they're optimistic. Even when the going gets tough, there's always the possibility of having an epic win, and everybody's working towards that together. And also the way that games are set up, which would be really great if we could set life up this way, is that there's a feedback loop, so that you're always given just something beyond your capacity level, so that you can do it, but it's not clear if you will do it. And if you do it, you will grow and expand. So there were some elements, and one of the things was the world-saving mission, and participating in something that really matters. And so that was, we had two inspirations: a conversation that we're going to talk about now, and then this other piece. So I just wanted to introduce that.
Great. And I think maybe to just follow your lead, Patricia, the whole idea of living, maybe the way to say it would be, how big a life are we willing to consider for ourselves is one that you and I have talked about. That most of us are conditioned, and we habitually see our lives in a fairly limited frame of reference. We see ourselves in a localized frame in different dimensions, in terms of time, in terms of space, in terms of effect. And of course, as Jane McGonigal spoke about in the video that you mentioned, she points out that the world we live in is obviously asking for big lives. It's in need of big human lives, not small human lives, but big. And her point in that video was that she felt that video gaming, and particularly these games of epic proportions, which are so popular. I've actually played World of Warcraft, and I never played enough to get very good at it, but I could certainly relate to her points that it's you're putting yourself in the place of a character. You're assuming an identity of someone who sees themselves having, at least in the global world of World of Warcraft, you see yourself as being a player in that world on a grand scale, and you realize that you can make a difference in that world for many people, or many creatures, whatever it would be in that game. And it's an identity that we find fun to try on, but it's not one that we're particularly used to. And I think the point she was bringing up is profound, which is our habitual identity is as a person that has fairly limited scope and scale of influence, that we tend to see ourselves as localized within a family unit or a community, or it may be slightly bigger than that, but we don't really see ourselves, nor do we aspire necessarily to play a grand part in the creation of the future. And I think it's interesting to note that as we've also talked about recently, I think the capacity to even see yourself in that way is a fairly new possibility. In other words, it was only, so this is being a history lover. I've read that it was only really during the Romantic era, which is the late 1700s, that it really started to become more popularly recognized that humanity was seen as part of a historical progression, a cultural evolutionary progression, and you started at that point with certain of the Romantic figures, both the philosophers and the poets, to recognize that we were progressing and that individual human beings could actually play a part in the forward progress. And what's interesting to note is the Enlightenment thinkers, who obviously played an enormous historical role, weren't a self-identified group of individuals. The Romantics are usually considered the first people who knew they were Romantics and who felt that they were actually going to have an influence on the unfolding of history. The Enlightenment thinkers weren't really thinking in those terms in quite the same way. So I just think it's an important conversation for all of us to have. How big a life are we thinking? Are we imagining for ourselves?
And I love that, and also given the trajectory of this radio, this outreach each week, it's also a part of being an evolutionary. It's part of the evolutionary conversation. Like you're saying, to see yourself in time, having some creative participation in evolution itself, and the evolution of culture, and the evolution of human beings, and the evolution of whatever aspect of life your particular karma seems to be, your destiny seems to be most alive with. It could be love or music or something that's, like you said, that's really a new notion. It's a new way of considering oneself. As we talk, I really want to invite everyone who's listening to take in the question, because it should be disturbing in a good way. That to think, because it's always like, oh, not me. There's always this sense of to ask yourself, could you have a historically significant life? There's always that, not me. There's who me, not me, couldn't be me. That's always somebody else that I think most of us have. So just to not completely listen to that as we talk.
No, right, because as I was saying to you the other day, if you survey people and ask them to make a list of their heroes, which I've done many times at different in different settings, it's interesting. You tend to get a lot of about the same dozen heroes, especially if you're leading spiritual types of events and evolutionary events, and you get the great saints, you get Gandhi, you get Martin Luther King, you get Mother Teresa, you get Nelson Mandela, and then there's variations on themes, and then some people throw in people they know more personally, but almost without exception, they are either people that had a big influence on your life personally, but more often than not, they're people that had a big influence on the world.
Mm-hmm.
So the people that we admire are people who have big influence on the world. And then I always find it interesting to then point out that although those are our heroes are the world makers and the people who really change things. It's not something that we can see for ourselves. And like you said, we have that habitual response of no, oh, who, me? I'm
Right.
not good enough. I'm not strong enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not courageous enough. The laundry list of reasons why we're probably going to live a much less significant life than our heroes.
Mm-hmm.
And I see this conversation as an opportunity to question that assumption and think, well, why not? Why not aspire to live a truly historically significant life? And what would it take to do that? What would that mean?
Well, I love that. The question, too, coming from the evolutionary standpoint is by asking the question in a serious way, in a way where you're actually asking yourself, like, why not? Why wouldn't I at least say yes to that
Right.
stream? Because it's a stream of creativity, it's a stream of energy. It's like once you say yes to that as a possibility, there's the possibility then of being pulled more into the core stream of where evolution is happening.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than just trying to be successful or just trying to, I don't know, get along in life or get through the day or whatever it is that we're doing, you're listening for a different station on the radio.
Right.
And then the possibility of there being how would you say it? It's like a linkage of what I happen to be somewhat gifted in, or at least passionate about or interested in, linking with where evolution is going. There's something then that can start to connect with each other.
Absolutely.
And then
right.
I can get drawn in and then find out, where I have missing skills or missing relationships with people or whatever, to be able to then be part of that. It's like a parade. It's like then you can step into the parade that's going down the street instead of
right.
standing on the side.
Right, right. Absolutely. And you're at that point, you're starting to take the first step
Mm-hmm.
of involvement at a different scale. And the first step is just imagining that it's possible.
Yeah.
Before you even do anything else, if you can't even imagine it's possible, you aren't really able to get, to go any further than that.
Right.
And once you imagine it's possible, as you said, you start to open up that possibility.
Yeah, that starts to happen. I mean, I was speaking with a good friend, my friend Lori Goldstein, who was her aunt was Aunt Betty Friedan, and Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique and was, many people would say the woman, at least in this particular part of the century, who helped start the women's movement. And so when you know someone, who then becomes historically famous, you also see that when they're in the middle meeting with their friends, their girlfriends, and talking and, beginning to have a conversation that's different than what everyone else is talking about, and they have at least the courage to say that they're not maybe as happy as they should be as housewives, and, there are things that they're thinking differently, that it wasn't apparent. I mean, Betty didn't know that was happening at the time,
right.
That she was being culturally significant.
Mm-hmm.
But she was
right.
following something, she was listening to something, and she was speaking something that then
right.
began to gather momentum, obviously.
It just occurred to me that it's important to not necessarily confuse a historically significant life from a famous life.
Yes.
Not everybody who plays a historically significant role becomes famous. Betty, Aunt Betty, as you said,
yeah,
is a well-known figure in the women's movement, and probably there were lots of people she was working with who helped enormously and led very significant, historically significant lives by supporting that movement that none of us have ever heard of.
That's right.
But without them, it wouldn't have happened.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, very good point. What we're going to do is we're going to continue the conversation about considering living an epic life, having historical significance in your life, and we're going to look at scale of time and influence and just some different interesting angles in this conversation that I think you'll find very interesting. So we'll be back in just a moment. Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Patricia Albere and I'm with Jeff Carreira, and we are having a conversation about considering the possibility of living an epic life. And I just want to underscore the beautiful perspective that Jeff was bringing forth just right before we took the break, which was, we were speaking about Betty Friedan, who's a historically known leader of the women's movement, and to be part of having an epic life and a historic life isn't necessarily the same as being famous. And so just to underline, all of the women, like in just that particular piece of history of evolution unfolding for us women and for the world, that there were hundreds and thousands of women that were a part of that unfoldment and participated in so much of what continues to unfold today. That is part of the historically significant. So, just to remember that part.
And it's good that, because that puts, I think that's one of the reasons why it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons it's hard for us to imagine, because we tend to have as our role models those few people that are famous, and that possibility feels out of reach. But like you said, there are always many people who are participating in any major cultural move forward. There's one Martin Luther King, but there were hundreds of thousands of people who, and their lives were historically significant because if they hadn't shown up, it wouldn't have happened.
Right.
And that's worth it. That is a historically significant life, and then it seems like that feels within the realm of possibility, more so than becoming a Martin Luther King or whoever who would be who's famous.
And also, just to also make the point is that to be a part of that evolutionary movement is different. To feel that you're in that, it's like a flow of energy, it's a flow of creativity, it's a flow of aliveness and consciousness and new ideas and people and connections and struggle. And, when you're in that wave, it is a different frequency.
Right.
It really is. And that's, for me, that's the part that's so compelling and exciting and important about considering this possibility, because it's an invitation into a certain wave of consciousness that you then get to be really a part of and create with all the other people that are a part of it.
And in the language that we often use, the work that we do with the Evolutionary Collective, for instance, it's about finding yourself on an evolutionary edge. You're on the edge of what hasn't happened yet and is starting to come about. It's where something new is happening, and it has that crackle of this is not the same old thing. This is something new, new potential. This is going to open up possibilities for future generations that are just closed right now. And you when you enter into that edge, you feel a rush of enthusiasm, and suddenly life means something in a very big context. It's not just me and what I'm going to get out of it. It's what's possible for everybody. It starts to become what drives you, and And if you have tasted that possibility, there's really no other life you want to live. Because every other life just doesn't seem like it's big enough.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's sort of almost less than human.
Totally. I mean, I'm moved. You know, I could just feel the excitement and just being moved by that. And also, it's truly different. I mean, you still have your life. You still, you know, go grocery shopping and, you know, do the various things that humans do. But that quality of being a part of that which is emerging is so thrilling. And you do, it is a slot. It's almost like you feel like you slot in, and there's a sense of, my life matters.
Right. And that's it's a good point that you bring up, because I think part of what makes this difficult for many of us to embrace is a fear that somehow the life is going to be too big, and it's going to sort of make it impossible for you to meet the normal responsibilities of being alive. But what you just said is that regardless of how big a life someone's living, they're still human, and they still exist in all domains. They still have to maintain a personal life, and they have to maintain everything that we all maintain. But that personal life is not the context of their life. It happens within a much bigger context, a historically significant context, and that, as you said, it changes everything. It gives you a sense that your life is of consequence, that it matters to be alive, that it's not, and at least in my own experience, and I know in yours, tasting the fact that life matters changes everything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that you're not just here; you're actually here for something.
Yeah.
You know, you have a real function, real purpose, and it's what so many people are missing. You know, in our postmodern world, there's very little sense of why are we doing what we're doing,
and pleasure and success doesn't quite cut it. You know, there's no amount of success and pleasure that you can come up with that ever feels the same.
Right.
And there's an enormous amount of pleasure and success often within, you know, having a purpose in your life that that's a part of something significant, which is interesting.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And also there's pleasure and there's success and there's challenge and there's failure, like every other part of life. And I think another reason why we find it difficult to embrace this possibility is we're afraid of the challenge and afraid of failing. And that's, we experience this in all sorts of aspects of life. I mean, I was a special needs teacher for a long time and realized at some point that a lot of reasons why children fail to learn is just because they're afraid to fail. And so they don't try, you know, to avoid the experience of failure. And I think in terms of living a big life, we often also feel, well, I couldn't do it. I'm not big enough. Well, you won't find out until you try. Maybe you are big enough. You know, that's at least as likely a possibility.
And if you're with all the other people, I know for me, when you know, many people know when I worked with Werner Erhard when I was 18, who started the Landmark Forum and was the leader, really, you know, we were the ones who created the whole notion of transformation and taking responsibility for your life, and, you know, all these different notions that are now live in the world. As, you know, we did make a difference. Is we made all kinds of mistakes. I mean, that's what you do. I mean, if you're in the space program and you're trying to get a man on the moon, I mean, and everybody's going for it, I mean, there's one thing that doesn't work after another until you find out how to get it to work. And so there's, I think, a lot more of an embrace if you're a part of something, because you recognize there's no other way to get there, especially when you're on the leading edge. Right. So there's more of a, okay then, let's just do it. And then when you fail, it still doesn't, it doesn't feel good, but you're discovering what's missing so you can do it better the next time, and then what's missing so you can do it better the next time. So it's one journey that becomes much more exciting than just trying to do things right.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about, because I loved the thing that you had brought up when we were having our own conversation about the scale of time. To speak a little bit about that in this evolutionary perspective, you change your way of being in time.
Right. That's great. I was thinking about that just as you were speaking about that spirit of you're going for it and you're failing and you're picking yourself up and you're learning and you're,
right.
that most often we find, or it's very typical that people find that kind of experience very hard to bear for long. We prefer not to experience failure and then we want to avoid experiencing failure. We want to have success. But as you're saying, in living an epic life, one of the things that changes is the time scale with which you see your life in. And if you are seeing your life in the time scale of just the time between when you were born and when you die, there's only so much failure you're going to be willing to withstand. But if you see yourself as starting when you're born and going into the indefinite future, if you see that your life is not about something that's supposed to happen during your lifetime, but it's about something that's happening for humanity, that's a project that's going to extend beyond your lifetime, then the way you start to relate, your whole scale of what's possible changes. The amount of failure you're willing to withstand because of the nobility of the purpose starts to go up. Little failures don't rock you anymore. Because you realize this is a big project. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And I can't, run at a sprint pace during the first 400 meters of a marathon and then just drop out, And so as you mentioned, what makes this new evolutionary, it's powerful, isn't it?
Yeah. Let me just say something too, because I'm just sensing, I was even thinking about the women's movement part of it, being a woman and being a beneficiary, a huge beneficiary, being a baby boomer from what was done, all the way through. I mean, it was longer than Betty Friedan. It went back. And that it's still going, to actually still be a part of the places where the edges are still unfolding.
Right.
There's a happiness. There's this happiness to contribute. There's no end point. I mean, one of the things about this sense of time is it's not about getting to a point.
Right.
So there's this process quality of being a part of an unfolding process that's going somewhere.
Right.
Rather than, okay, we got to the end goal, done, now we can stop.
Right, absolutely. And it's a completely different sense. And I know that you've been reading my friend and colleague's book, Evolutionaries, Carter Phipps's book, and I have been as well. And this whole the whole idea of evolution, which has really come online in a big way over the last few hundred years, and is now entering into mainstream culture. And you and I, the work we're doing with the Evolutionary Collective, the work I've been doing with Enlightenment Next, is all part of the wave of, we need to reconsider what human life is about now that we know that we are part of an evolving process. That's a recognition that demands that you don't just do business as usual. And that's Carter's point with the book, is this changes the game. This is not about, it's not about me and my life. It's not about me and my country. It's not even only about me in this world.
Right.
It's about me and the evolution of consciousness. It's about me and where is this thing going to end up in the indefinite future. And what role am I willing to see myself playing in that kind of a landscape? and it's bigger than the human mind can completely grasp, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
You know, we're able to grasp evolution today in ways and at a scale that you couldn't possibly grasp it 100 years ago. It wasn't available to human consciousness, and it's becoming more and more available.
And once again, I mean, I love what you said, and I'm excited. I'm going to get to talk to Carter next week about his book that'll be coming out in July, Evolutionary. So that'll be, everybody should tune into that. But what I'm also getting is there's some relaxation. Like I know, me personally, I feel when I feel the expanse of where we've come from, and I feel like all of history into me, and then going forward, it feels different. I mean, it really, there's a different feeling of connectedness. I know I shared with you, I can't remember why, but one time when I had given birth, to my son, and I had this moment, after 39 hours of labor, I was delirious, but I felt this historical connection in that moment with all the women who have ever given birth to all of humanity.
Right.
It was like all of the women who had brought human beings into the world since the beginning of time, that I was a part of that.
Right.
And yeah, it was just, there's something moving in those places where our consciousness can keep expanding, to feel the whole trajectory while I'm here, I'm Patricia, I'm doing my, I'm part of life in this moment. I'm part of history happening now, but I'm part of something larger. So there's also a quality of being less separate.
Right. And I think I love what you said about, because as we approach this possibility of a life this big, there's some apprehension about it. But as you said, the more you embrace it, what you find is the more you feel relief. There's a certain kind of relief, because for one thing, you realize when you were limiting the scope of your life to, the birth to death and what happened in between to you, and you were trying, usually without much success, you were trying to extract some sense of meaning that would make sense of your existence. And when you start to step back, you think, oh, well, of course that wasn't going to work. I was looking at one lifetime on one planet of 6 billion people, and I was trying to find why was I here in just of reality, that little bit of, but when you see, no, I'm actually part of the development of an entire planet, and that's part of the development of an entire cosmos, and I'm a very tiny, but significant and potentially very significant part of everything. That it makes sense.
I love it. So that's, so the conversation about scale, what scale and connection of our consciousness in time is obviously part of this conversation, which is considering, what would it mean to have an epic life? So thank you. That was great. And we're going to take another break. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about another element of scale, which has to do with the scale of influence, another way of expanding our dimensionality. And I'm here with Jeff Carreira. Welcome back, everyone. This is Patricia Albere, and I'm here with Jeff Carreira, and we are exploring what it is to consider having an epic life. And so the next area that we want to explore has to do with scale. We're looking at scale of things, which is part of an evolutionary perspective that we're obviously very involved in the work that we're doing. And we want to look at the scale of influence. What's the level of influence that we see having?
Right, and that's an interesting conversation, and it's similar but different to what we spoke about in terms of time. What's the time scale in which we see ourselves? And this has to do with what is the scope of influence that we're willing to imagine is possible. And similarly, we don't tend to imagine that we could have an enormous influence. It's easy to imagine that I can influence my friends, I can influence my family, I can influence the place that I work at, maybe I can influence my neighborhood, my community, my town, and beyond that, it gets hard for most people to imagine. You can kind of imagine the possibility of maybe a national level of influence, but again, we are challenging the limitations that we place on influence.
And influence is different than doing something. So you can do things, but the distinction, influence, you can do a lot of things. You can build something. It doesn't necessarily have influence. It doesn't necessarily have some kind of lasting, permeating quality that's a part of something. So I think, I know that when we were doing the work with Werner and the whole notion of making a difference and the words of transformation, and we had no idea that that was actually going to change, that would be normal 30 years later in the conversation.
Right. And I'll mention this because you and I have spoken about it. It's yet another historical reference, but it's an interesting one. And it helps make this distinction between not only is influence not doing something, but influence isn't also the same as being famous. And the reference that I have is in the late 1900s, there were two individuals who were both very active in terms of, at least in America, what we would now see as evolutionary spirituality. And one was a gentleman by the name of John Fiske. The other was a gentleman by the name of Charles Sanders Peirce. John Fiske was enormously popular in his time. He was a best-selling author. He was, they didn't have rock stars in those days, but he was like a rock star. He'd speak to packed audiences. Lectures was part of the entertainment of the time, and he was very popular, had best-selling books, best-selling by the standard of the day. And Charles Sanders Peirce, on the other hand, was dramatically unknown, didn't really even find his way to make a living most of the time very successfully. And yet, Charles Sanders Peirce is considered, arguably the greatest American genius that there ever was, and has had an enormous influence on the whole study of evolutionary philosophy and made major contributions, major scientific contributions. There's a true Renaissance individual who has global influence in his spheres. And John Fiske essentially was forgotten. His ideas weren't particularly influential. They weren't particularly original. And although he had a certain kind of influence at the time, because obviously he was publicizing and making more public big ideas, his lasting influence is much smaller in scale. And so you have to think about what it would mean to live a life of influence. It isn't necessarily a big splash, at the time, and often it's not. And again, it relates to the time scale. Are you trying to have influence over a day, a week, a year, a lifetime, or multiple generations? And how far out are you willing to see yourself propagating in terms of influencing, in terms of having an effect on the way people live and think and are?
And I remember when you told me, we were having that conversation. It was that was also a relief. There's a relief to that, and I hope that as people are listening to this, they feel a relief, because the whole thing on the internet now, becoming an expert and learning how to get all your stuff out there, and there's this really big promotion of how do you reach more and more people, and there's a big push in that, and that's useful. I mean, it's not that it's not useful, but not to let that drown out the willingness and the desire to get it within, so close to where the edge of your consciousness is going, even if it's not popular. And that sounds like what he did. Do you know what I mean? Like, he was willing to stay with like where thinking was going, which often isn't popular. People that are on the leading edge of things often don't make any sense to people. It sounds like wah wah wah. When they talk, people are like, what are they talking about? And why am I even interested? Because how does this relate to life right now?
Right.
So I think that for people to also feel encouraged that the places where you have insight or your creativity is taking you somewhere that maybe isn't completely understood by the people around you, that's also potentially could be an area where your influence actually exists.
Right, and exactly, and part of it has to do with, well, one is really intending to have influence and being willing to have influence, and the other is to really have the tenacity to stay with your vision and to stick with what you believe is truly significant and historically consequential, and not be veered off in all of the different directions that will tempt all of us.
Yeah. And it may be that only 2% of the planet understands you at any given time, depending on what you're innovating, and that's fine. That may not have anything to do with what matters in the long run.
Right, and it's a moment to appreciate the depth of vision and the bigness of heart that is called for to even begin to contemplate the possibility of living an epic life. A big human life.
Yeah.
Not a small life.
I also. Oh, sorry.
No, go.
I was just going to say too, like what I want to, what I'm moved to encourage people in that are listening and thinking about these things is also to lean into, because sometimes we don't even listen to the place in us that is drawn towards some possibility, some way of being, something that seems too positive or too out there, that to go in that direction, to give it energy, to give it credibility, to give it your time and attention, and to know that may in fact be the place where you're in that stream of where evolution wants to happen.
Right.
And a lot of times people get too practical, or they marginalize those thoughts and feelings and passions and interests to the point where it doesn't speak to them anymore. That part of them shuts off, and then they stay within a realm that doesn't allow them to actually have influence.
And it just occurred to me while you were saying that another thing that's important to consider is we're not promoting the idea of an epic life in the sense that the world needs a small but not insignificant number of heroes to lead the rest of us forward. I mean, that might also be true.
Right.
But actually, our world needs all human beings to see themselves in epic proportions. We aren't going to solve problems like global warming by thinking small or by thinking nationally. At the very least, you need to be thinking globally, and it certainly appears that it may be necessary that we see ourselves as part of the evolving cosmos, that hugeness of scale is what's going to allow us to start to feel an emotional connection for why the experiment of this planet has to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Not just so that the people on it can keep living,
Right.
but because as far as we've gotten in terms of the evolution of consciousness, the life forms on this planet and the level of consciousness that they're able to exhibit can't just end. It has to propagate forward to wherever its ultimate destiny is. And only in a picture that big do you start to feel the energy that could lead to the sorts of changes that need to be made among human beings in order to not just survive our current challenges, but also propel ourselves into the future, into a real evolutionary trajectory.
And in the science, with the things people continually discover, is that it is unpredictable. You know what I mean? That the unpredictability is more really what's going on. So the epic win comes back, that at any moment we actually could have an epic win in different areas and domains and dimensions, that evolution tends to leap forward.
Right.
It's like you work on something, you work on something, you work on something, it looks like it's not going anywhere, and then all of a sudden it goes boop, and something transforms, and then you're in a different place. Right. And that's actually often more the case. It's not slow and steady progress. It's like kind of almost like try, no progress, and then all of a sudden the thing happens. So there's, the epic win, I think, is not just a video game dimension of what's compelling, but that we actually innately know that we should have this kind of urgent optimism that they have on video games.
Right.
And that an epic win is ever possible. Mm-hmm. We only have a couple of minutes left, and so I do want to mention, and then we can say a couple more things, that Carter Phipps will be on. I'll be speaking with him next week on May 22nd, and his new book that's going to be coming out in July is called Evolutionaries. And we're going to talk about, like, what does it mean to be an evolutionary? This is kind of a new distinction, a new way of discovering who oneself is. My guess is those of you who are listening may find out that you actually are evolutionaries and that you have the qualities and the interests in being one. And there's something validating when you hear what some of the distinctions are. One of them has to do with this difference in the way that one sees time. Mm-hmm. So that's, obviously one of the characteristics. And it's, understanding it, I find, helps to make yourself move forward even more powerfully. So we have a couple of minutes left. Anything else that you want to say, Jeff, in kind of wrapping up this conversation, or what people might want to think about to take it deeper?
I think the point of a conversation like this is that it helps break us out of whatever limiting ideas we have about ourselves, about who we are, mm-hmm. about what's possible for us, and what kind of life we can and cannot live. And as I said earlier, the first step is to honestly and authentically entertain the possibility, first, that you could live a historically significant life, and even more significantly, that you come to the place where you intend to live one.
Yeah.
There's one thing to know you could if that's what happens, and it's another thing to say, no, I'm actually going to do it.
Yeah.
And it's a huge step for any of us, and it's well worth seriously considering the possibility. It's what our world needs, and it's what the evolution of consciousness needs.
And by saying that you're willing, even if you don't feel like you're hooked up, your willingness and your intention to do that you will begin to get the right messages, opportunities, relationships, so that you can step into that stream with other people, and that's for sure. Yes. So one last thing. So I want to thank everyone for listening live with us, or listening to this later. I do want to mention there's a blog that I did. If you go to our website, evolutionarycollective.com, There's the most recent blog has the video of the TED Talk, which I think will be very informative for you. And then a series of questions. So there's some questions on there that you could really take to heart and think about and look at that can just deepen the conversation that we just had. The other announcement that I just want to mention is that I will be in Los Angeles at the end of June teaching the Evolutionary Relationships course. So anybody who lives in California, I hope you'll come and join me. I'd love to meet with you and work together in this way live. So thank you, and thank you, Jeff, and we'll see everybody
Thank you.
next week. Have a great week.